Another game which has unearthed itself through the rearrangement of the office process is Epiphany by Greg Porter. And this came out in the mid 90s. And it is, not surprisingly, heavily influenced by Magic the Gathering. It breaks down really nicely. This is the first version. I believe a later, thicker version is available digitally right now. But anyway, in this slim volume, it breaks down really easily into the setting and what characters are like and system stuff for this and system stuff for that. And it's real clear characteristic of the BTRC publishing company. And so briefly, it's set in Hyperborea, in the ancient antiquity, when this was a balmy land surrounded by ice, of course, but you see it's the warm air that's continually being blown up through the hole into the hollow earth, which keeps the whole area all balmy and interesting. So there are the nations of Atlantis and Mu and so forth and Lemuria, and there are various interactions with one another, with the mysteries of the entrance to the hollow earth, and also if you get past the ring of ice, then the somewhat inconsequential odd people to the south. South meaning in any direction from where you are. Okay, well, there's the map, and there's a cool mountains and a canal that goes from the ocean outside this landmass, spilling into the hollow earth, and it's a map. Well, the general culture and peoples is very easy to grasp. It is kind of the wonderful barbaric scientific antiquities that we've all grown to know and love from Victorian and post-Victorian adventure literature, with all sorts of influences, the coming race, obviously, and things like that. But also, through the lens of Burroughs and Howard and similar writers who have a somewhat different sensibility. Okay, I'm not even sure I need to go into it. It's been mined so thoroughly and revamped or adopted so thoroughly across so many works that it shouldn't really be very hard. I mean, Clark Ashton Smith in my mind, is a strong player, although that kind of sort of deliberately startling exoticism isn't really evident in this work. Okay, fair, right? The sort of the non-tropical version of Atlantis. Kind of a good way to look at it. So yes, it's heavy metal poor, so therefore the metals are aluminum alloys and stuff like that. And the gems, lots and lots of gems. So, imagine, weird aluminum swords and spears and gems. So I could kind of keep going. I mean, the monsters have a boreal feel, much talk of ice bears and so on. Okay. With all this in hand, and remembering a culture of immense antiquity, immense local history, and an immense history of scholarship and science, insofar as we can think of, cool fantasy science circa 1900. And one thing I kind of like about this, actually, nothing British. There's no hint of British imperial values. I mean, the peoples are quite arrogant, of course, but not in the same way, and the relationship with the world is different, and there isn't a Victorian social value sensibility at work. Because a lot of stuff that borrows these motifs nowadays seem to me to be very heavily invested in Victoriana, and this isn't. So think much more pulp much more, well, we'll talk about the situations of play in a minute, but I don't know, maybe I'm getting somewhere with this or just repeating myself. Either way, that's the setting. Now, the system of play, as I say, is super heavily involved with Magic the Gathering, and it's also drawing on recent games of the time, most notably Fudge and Over the Edge, in the sense that you're making up the character's attributes. Familiarly, there's physical ones, mental ones, and spiritual ones, and then you make up things in them that are of that nature. And those in this particular game are called abilities. And then there's a tertiary level. Okay, so we have the basics, right? Physical, mental, spiritual, and then the secondary level, which are the abilities, and then the tertiary level, which you might think of the system in action that are called advantages. So say you call on an ability so that you will use it as an advantage. And then there are some things that only exist on your sheet as advantages, and you can use those too. So it's this array of potential and explicit advantages in a given situation that you actually use as the thing that gets things done in this particular moment. And in this game, you often are putting them at risk, whether knocked out of the conflict, which is a risk, or actually risking their loss and damage and reduction and things like that, which is more permanent and painful to your character sheet. The beginning characters are not blessed with a lot. They have a very limited number of resources to build your character with, and are expected to be rather low, well, what he calls below average status, which you and I would call ordinary. The status levels of the games are very explicit, and the wealth needed to maintain them is very explicit, in your character's financial circumstances at any time is pretty much a driver of play. And this sort of thing can be traced all the way back to, Traveler and the early fantasy trip, where you are the original In the Labyrinth, where you actually have weekly income and weekly expenses. And you can see that in some of the early superhero games and things like that. This is not quite as nuanced. You are not counting pennies, and you are dealing with abstract wealth levels and abstract status levels. But it's a really important thing that you know exactly where your status is and exactly where your wealth is at any time, in terms of what you can actually go and accomplish. So with that in mind, that this is very much a wealth and status management game, with slavery, lurking in the wings at any time to nab you. And with the interestingly enough, it's very skewed. The lower levels are not very nuanced. There's only a couple, so from below average down to, more below average marginalized slave. That's it. From average on up, there's a whole bunch of levels. It's really nuanced going up. So all the way to, the Wizard Kings of Atlantis and stuff like that. But it's kind of interesting. You get the idea that getting out of the economic doldrums and kind of into that, on the absolute scale, intermediate, which is far above, what you might think of as intermediate social status, up in this kind of, where status really actually is going to generate big results for you and others, and you're not at the top of the heap. You're not ruling vast lands or anything, but you are, in fact, a player. That seems to me to be kind of where the ups and downs of wealth and status have nuances and differences among characters. So clearly they're going to need to get into those positions of status. And the game starts you a little low in that regard. I was actually looking at the character creation rules and saying, how this is, are we stuck in another one where I want to be a badass barbarian, but I'm basically, a hopeful dude with a stick? What is that? What's going on? But on the other hand, the example character they make is kind of cool. He's this old guy with a spunky young apprentice. And so you're actually kind of playing two characters, and he seems like he can do a thing or two. So maybe I just need to take it through a few iterations of character creation. Now, granted, he's below average status and so on, but it's not like he can't do anything. So I'm kind of interested. That looks, I mean, I don't think it's a you can make anybody game in the setting with the character creation rules, because you can't. You are definitely going to have to take a hit in some sphere of character activity in order to be good at anything. So, all right. You're making up characters that will either, at some level of the status and wealth ladder are going to be in the thick of interacting about that. Good enough. Now, what kind of stuff, can you do? And the answer is there's quite a lot in terms of concept. Not because there's huge lists or something in the game, because it's a slim little book, but there's a lot of room to, make up a cool thing, and enough inspirational material where I think it's not that hard. But how is it done? Well, this is going to sound very familiar to you, because if you've got a conflict, you basically take all the advantages that you can muster to use in it, and this becomes like a little bank, and then you go 1, 2, 3, and with one hand you pop up however many of the advantages you're using for offense, and with the other you pop up however many of the advantages you're using for defense, put them out, and since you're using your right hand and your left hand respectively, you put them out and it's opposed to the other person, and you can easily see who has more of what. And then, the offensive stuff that gets past the defense will knock away advantages for the next round. So that's very much, of course, like the, opposing factions or individuals or opponents in Magic. So that's basically the system of resolution. How it relates to role-playing situations is, I think, something of a work in progress in these rules, and whether it's capable of, there are dice systems which are, actually much less complicated than this, and I still think that many of them are a work in progress as to just what we can do and say and enjoy out of this. So I'd like to try it. Everybody was, I say everybody, I and many, many other people, upon getting invested in Crack the Gathering, certainly turned to our role-playing tables and said, now, what are we getting out of Magic Combat that we're not getting out of our role-playing games? And why do we like that? And so how do we apply? And in this case, they basically just ripped away all the serial numbers and said, okay, we're just going to do that and see. And nowhere as obviously as in the Magic, in which much of the same logic occurs, but you will recognize tons of stuff. There's mana, there's using the mana, and then there's the resetting of the mana in the next round, and then there's the summoning of the things. And it's taken, fairly literally. The mages are standing, flickering in space and not space at the same time, and their physical bodies are being attacked by the things that are summoned by the other person. Now, if the two characters are in the same spot, that's, sort of understandable. They're standing there kind of looking at each other, and then two ghostly armies are, attacking, and then they're making up defenders, to surround their own selves as blockers, and you can switch the position of attacker and defender, in the blink of an eye. So very much like the board of Magic when you've marshaled your creatures against the other person, and the damage is being done to you. So same thing. A lot of the same ideas too. There's a difference between, the summoning of something and then they act on the next turn, but they can be used to block, and the instance that can be done anytime. And the language for it is quite clean and rather expertly devoid of anything actionable in terms of terminology, even though the functionality is pretty much one-to-one. One of the problems with early Magic the Gathering rules was that once you got a lock on an opponent, it was pretty much a matter of, whittling them down, and reversals, strategic play in the late stage of games were were limited. And that changed a lot later. But in the mid-90s, that's what playing Magic was often like. Leading either to quick kills with very little card play, or to these enormous arrays of defenses, and then the two people are kind of peering over their ramparts, dinking at each other and occasionally getting 1 point of damage in. So anyway, the question is whether this would suffer a bit from those tendencies, because the array of types of defense or angles of attack, or ways to shift up the parameters of play, all those design features that came into Magic the Gathering and related games later, are pretty lean here. Particularly in the sense of the quick kill, because in this case, the knocking out of your advantages, really just hamstrings you for the next round. So I'm not sure. Are all the Magic combats going to be 2 rounds, right? We clash, see who the luck of the draw favors that particular time, and then, and whoever gets that, well, they're just going to drive the other one into oblivion ASAP. You'll recognize a lot of other things. For your mana and the spells, you draw them at random. You can only take so many at a time, and then you draw 1 at a time for each new round, so it is exactly the same. Another thing that is very much the same. Oh man, I had it in my mind. Anyway, there's other aspects of it. So you are, deck drawing, and you set up your set of advantages, right? In the beginning is what you're going to be using for this combat. So that is deck building. There are the different elements, right? And so anyway, can you play Magic the Gathering as a role-playing game? That is the question of this system, and it is presented in an exceptionally clean and understandable way, without any ifs and ands and buts and stuff. This is how you do it. And it's sort of sufficiently dramatic because all Magic is shades. You see, it's all shades of the past and of the present. A little bit of Wizard of Earthsea. You have to get to know something, like with a big capital K. You got to know something really intimately in order to use it as a shade. Or you rip away the spell from someone else and now it's yours. Every spell is unique. That was the thing I forgot a minute ago, that in winning decisively, you can actually nip away the spell and actually have it now. And you don't get spells by just spending character points. You actually have to go and get them in the game world, and so learn to know something, and you got to kill a bear yourself, before you can have a spell of summon Ice Bear. And most people are not interested in doing this. They would prefer very greatly to not have to kill an Ice Bear and to simply go and beat up another mage who has that spell and take it. So you can easily see the early Magic the Gathering, when everybody had a very limited set of cards that they bought, and everybody was playing actually hardcore, where the loser had to give up the risked card to the ownership of the other person. Those were rather saber-toothed days in the game store play of Magic, when the first tournaments were just beginning. And anyway, there's a lot of that in here, in the culture of the mages, right? Of basically swiping spells from each other. So what about the situations of play? And this is where the mid-90s really shows itself. There's a very, again, the clarity of the text helps us. And so it's not really a critique of this specific game, rather than a critique of kind of the culture of play at the time. But the game is surprisingly excellent in its presentation of it. So rather than say this game epitomizes that way to play, I would rather say that the clarity of this text, sort of exposes this sort of play to the light of day, without pretense. So let's see. Long-term ideas, espionage in preparation for war, seeking out dangerous knowledge for a powerful mage, political intrigues within a country, exploration of the hollow earth, keeping dangerous secrets out of the hands of enemies, finding out what is causing an increase in volcanic activity, secret plans for rebellion against the established order. So those are sort of your campaign ideas. And then they talk about group solidarity, which is another way of saying how we met, which you could play. You could play how we met. It mentions that how hard you want to make that is up to you, but then it only concerns itself with the most difficult situation, which is a whole bunch of independently made characters who have no concept at work here. So we have hired by a person or group based on their disparate talents, escaped from prison together, now trying to find safety, working against a common enemy, sole survivors of an ill-fated Hollow Earth expedition, captured by pirates and forced to work together to escape, ruined by a bad business venture, now trying to pool talents. The adventure, short adventure and minor setting to use in your Epiphany campaign, which occupies the last few pages of the book, called Blood and Honor, is a fairly, I think, perfect example of this attitude toward play, that it doesn't really matter who your characters are, but we're going to make up some reason why we all, quote, have to work together, and then you present a goal as represented by some non-player character, which you now need to adopt. They may or may not be sincere in their promise to reward you. They may or may not be even sincere in the actual goal, but that's the context. And, then you start asking, what can I do? What do I see? And what do I do? What can I see? What can I do? Can I do this? What do I see next? Okay, what happens? And so, you're basically just kind of sitting there, playing catcher to the pitches, and that's what you do. I find the setting is probably a little more inspiring than that. It would be kind of neat, I think, instead to riff on some aspect of this setting itself and get a little different approach. But that puts me in the position of rewriting certain assumptions of the game, which are not really systemic. You wouldn't really have to change anything system-wise, I think. And I would really heavily focus on that status and wealth issue in terms of the impact that the characters feel upon doing things, and also the impact that they may have given their particular status and what they want to achieve that only a particular level of status permits, and what they can achieve if they don't have it. Stuff like that, I think, would be enough framework to use from the text of the game without literally adding a way to play with its own mechanical support, perhaps, or just parallel way to play next to the game, which I kind of don't want to do. But I certainly don't want to play the way that the example adventure presents. So, again, I'm kind of in this position with a lot of the 90s games, and have become pretty, I may say, pretty skilled at finding what to do. I think I talked about this with Mutant Chronicles as well. So I'd be in the same position with this. But anyway, there's a lot to, there's a lot to like about what you see. The clarity, the precision with which given concepts are presented, and there's very little difficulty in understanding, what things look like, or the sort of tropes and motifs and the look of it all in a small volume is quite nicely presented. And I would like to present that and then say, okay, now what will we do with that? And then carry forward from there. All right, those are my thoughts. And I would venture to try this one, I think, pretty quick, actually. The fascination with system as such, of course, would be nicely scratched. And also, I think that the engaging quality of the example character and his sidekick is a huge win for me. And in that you look at that and you go, oh, I like that guy. And so if we started with characters of that kind, where everybody comes in, we all look, and I'm like, oh wow, look at these people. What could they get up to? Then I think that we're cooking very nicely, and that the game would be very enjoyable.